Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the virtual world of the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, now the Emeritus Co-Executive Director. And I am delighted that Janet Weaver is joining us tonight to talk about her piece on Pearl McGill and the Button Cutters Union in Iowa and more. Kind of a classic microcosmic study, looking very closely at something in particular in order to raise large questions. I'd like to ask everybody to mute your audio so that if you have an obstreperous dog or child or siren going by, we're not all going to listen to it. We're trying to do one event at least a month on labor history. Sometimes there are events with books and authors of books. Sometimes there are discussions of articles. And we try to get the authors to join us. And we're very pleased that Janet Weaver from the Iowa Historical Society has joined us tonight. There will not be a quiz for me to find out how many of you actually read her article. But you have access to it. If you didn't get to it before tonight, you can certainly read it afterwards. Let's see. Janet has a PhD from the University of Iowa, where she researched and wrote about what she titled The Big Fight for Justice, Industrial Women and the AFL, 1881 to 1917. I'm sure some of that will filter through what we see tonight. And I absolutely love the fact that the Iowa Historical Society has all this great documentary material generated by Pearl McGill. And so Janet doesn't only organize stuff and put it away for other people to read, but she found it to be rich and to create this story that she's sharing with us tonight. So the plan is that Janet is going to show a PowerPoint and talk us through it. Then we will open up for questions and encourage you to unmute your video as well as your audio in the hopes that we'll build some community in having this conversation as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Janet, and the process of edification can begin. Go ahead, Janet.
Okay. Let's go back one. Okay, thank you very much, Peter. You know, today's International Women's Day, and I can't think of a better way to celebrate than by talking about Pearl McGill. I first learned about Pearl nearly 20 years ago. That's very hard for me to believe. It happened when a student came into the Iowa Women's Archives at the University of Iowa Libraries, where I work, and she said that she knew someone who was the niece of a woman who had been involved in a button workers' strike in Muscatine in 1911, and had also been involved in the textile workers' strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912. And so she put me in contact with Jean Burns. Jean was Pearl McGill's niece. And Jean Burns and I, we got together, a couple of times over the next couple of years. And then in 2006, we went together to attend the convention of the Iowa Federation of Labor in Waterloo, Iowa. And we went specifically for the induction of Pearl McGill into the Iowa Labor Hall of Fame. And it was on that evening when I took Jean home that she handed the letters of Pearl McGill for me to preserve in the Iowa Women's Archives. And we would get together and she would say, well, so-and-so's written about Pearl. Everybody who came across the letters, of course, became very infatuated with Pearl's story, and they wrote about her. And Jean would say to me, "When are you going to write something?" And I would say, "Well, I'm thinking about it," but it seemed to me very complicated and somewhat overwhelming. And in 2011, in addition to working full-time in the Iowa Women's Archives, I entered the PhD program in the history department at Iowa. And I had the good fortune to work with Shel Stromquist, and I finished my dissertation. And the article published in Labor is based on a part of that dissertation. So this is how the letters looked when Jean handed them to me back in 2006. The family had preserved them in an old cigar box, and they'd kept them very carefully for many years. I think one reason was because Pearl died when she was young. She was just 29 when she was shot outside of her home in Buffalo, Iowa, allegedly by her former husband. So you can see from the letters that they're written on different letterheads: the Women's Trade Union League, the United Mine Workers of America, but not all of the letters survived. Jean recalled that during the 1950s, her mother, who was Pearl's older sister, had burned some of the most radical letters saying that McCarthy's not going to get me. But the surviving letters still were enough to provide a trail that led to rich resources in the Women's Trade Union League and the AFL, and really underutilized newspaper sources in New England. And between 1909 and 1913, young working class women emerged as leaders in uprisings in the garment, textile, and button industries. And Pearl McGill was involved in this struggle. And as Peter said, she described it as a big fight for justice. She was born in 1894 on an Iowa farm. And at 16, like many girls of her age, she went to work in one of Muscatine's many button factories. And in the photograph on the right, you see her in the back right. She's marked there, standing outside the factory where she worked. Between 1911 and 1912, she was indeed involved in two nationally significant strikes: the famous Lawrence Textile Strike and the lesser-known strike of button workers in Muscatine. We can see McGill as emblematic of many youthful voices of wage-earning activists who've disappeared from historical memory. A few, like McGill, left traces on the historical record. A close look at local narratives of the story of the button workers helps us see just how vulnerable elite craft unions were, like the old male-dominated unions in textiles and steels. Faced with new mass production in technologies that swept the country, a new generation of radical young semi-skilled mass production workers rose up to demand their rights. McGill was an organizer and elected officer in her union, which was a federal labor union, as you can see from this letter written to her dear folks at home on the letterhead of the Button Workers Protective Union number 12854, an affiliate of the American Federation of Labor. It was organized along industrial lines. It included everyone from shell sorters and button cutters to machine operators. And you can see that McGill held the elected position of recording secretary of her local, and she was one of 3 women serving on the executive board of the union. The BWPU, as it was called, was a federal labor union. That's a very particular type of union, a local union that's directly affiliated with the national AFL. McGill worked closely with the Women's Trade Union League. This organization was founded in 1903. It was a non-voting affiliate of the AFL. It wasn't a union. Its purpose was to help wage-earning women organize unions to improve their pay and working conditions. They had helped women garment workers in New York and Chicago during the famous uprisings in 1909 and 1911. And in fact, the Chicago garment strike was just ending as the Muscatine button workers strike was starting. McGill was also a leading activist with the industrial workers of the world in Lawrence. And so within a relatively short period of time, between 1910 and 1913, McGill had interacted with a broad spectrum of the labor organizations of her day. Now, concurrent with McGill's birth in 1894, the freshwater pearl button industry was rapidly gaining a foothold in the United States. Small factories sprang up in Muscatine and as well as many other inland river towns. In fact, they sprang up wherever the mussels proliferated that provided the shells for the manufacture of pearl buttons. And Muscatine quickly became a major center for this new and rapidly expanding industry. By 1900, the freshwater pearl button industry, which didn't exist before 1890, stretched from the upper Midwest to New England. And by 1905, Iowa factories produced over half of the national product. Manufacturers that had previously centered their operations on the East Coast now opened new factories in Muscatine and other areas of the Midwest, so they could be near the raw materials that supplied the industry. The work was done on a piece rate basis in a highly mechanized production process with a gendered division of labor. Here you can see men cutting blanks from clam shells. They used a circular saw to cut as many blanks as possible from each of the shells. Water was sprayed onto the saws during the cutting to control the dust and keep the equipment cool. It really was a sort of dangerous and difficult job, and workers wanted to organize to improve their conditions of work. The industry developed very rapidly from small shops to heavily capitalized factories. And here you can see an example of the Bipley button shop in Muscatine, built in 1895, just as the industry was taking off. It's like a smaller cottage industry. Within 5 years, Bipley had replaced it with the modern Pioneer Button Company, built in 1896. Now, this is a fact, one of actually several larger factories in Muscatine, each employing a few hundred or several hundred workers. So things change very, very quickly. Between 1900 and 1910, the button industry consolidated as larger factories squeezed out smaller shops. At the very beginning, anybody could get involved in the button industry. They could just set up a shed in their backyard and have a saw, but things changed very quickly. One of the largest factories in Muscatine was the McGill plant. It was located right by the Mississippi near the railroad tracks. And in the bottom photograph, you can see inside of the finishing department. It's lined with these very double automatic machines. These machines were key to the industry's growth, where before converting a blank, that the men cut blanks out of the clamshells into a finished button involved many different operations with these machines, which actually cost about $1,200 each. You could cut the grooves and make the patterns on the blanks and do the drilling in one continuous operation. Of course, these machines were operated by women. Women's work was indispensable to the industry. It was dangerous and difficult. Employers considered women to be more dexterous in operating this machinery, and most importantly, they could, of course, employ them at lower wages. Like other mass production workers, button workers responded to poor wages and working conditions by organizing federal labor unions that were directly affiliated with the national AFL. Although thousands of federal labor unions existed during the Progressive Era, they remain understudied within scholarship on the AFL. Dorothy Sue Cobble's one of few scholars to assess the importance of these early federal labor unions. She argues they afforded countless workers an opportunity to organize and join the labor movement quickly, which they certainly did. By broadening Cobble's analysis to incorporate case studies, we can start to see the crucial role of city centrals, state federations, and communities in nurturing what were often isolated fledgling locals. As I looked for evidence of pro-McGill, I was surprised to find that the records of federal labor unions, which I expected to find in large numbers because there were so many of them, were basically missing from the archival records of the AFL. I learned that in the 1950s, the AFL had destroyed most of the records of these federal labor unions, the ones that have failed to become permanently established. And I think this helps to explain why historians haven't looked at early federal labor unions. And I think it also makes the history of Iowa button workers more significant. This is a chart of button worker federal labor unions, all the button worker federal labor unions in the country. The data set, you're looking for you expect to find information and you don't find it. And then you find another way to figure it out. And this happened for me searching. This data set for this chart is based on the AFL financial reports that tracked the dues payments of its affiliated unions. And that helped me to figure, you can follow the money, right? That helped me to figure out how many button worker locals there were in the country and how long they lasted. And it specifically shows the button worker locals that existed between 1897 and 1916. My daughter happens to be a geology professor, and I was telling her, I was excited about what I was finding, and she said, "Mom, that's what I do. I track persistence and extinction in the fossil record for the Natural Archive." And so she very kindly was able to use my data to create this chart to show persistence and extinction among button worker FLUs during this early period. So what you see here are the federal local numbers on the left side of the chart, and the years are along the bottom of the chart. The Muscatine button unions are in red. The Midwest is in blue, and the East Coast is in green. Unidentified locals are in black, and the small squares represent locals that lasted for less than a year. So looking at the red locals, the first button workers local was founded in Muscatine in 1897. And the button workers twice attempted to form a national union of button workers in 1903. So you can see the first button local, it comes to an end in 1903. And again in 1909, you can see the second red button worker local come to an end in 1909. The AFL's executive committee was always vigilant of the tendency of national industrial unions to develop quickly and attain numerical power, and they deflected the efforts of these locals to form national unions. So in this chart, I think what we can see is the strength of the impulse for unionization among mass production workers. And another thing about federal labor unions that I think is interesting is that the numbering system of FLUs can be seen as a continuation of the numbering system of local assemblies of the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor organized everyone, regardless of race, occupation, or gender, into local or mixed assemblies on a community-wide basis. At its peak, it was by far the largest labor organization in the country, with about 700,000 members in 1886. In the 1890s, especially west of the Mississippi, it was by no means clear that the AFL held the power or credibility to promote the interests of an increasingly diverse working class. Few wage earners in Iowa belonged to craft labor unions, and they were much more likely to have joined an assembly of the Knights of Labor than to have been a member of an AFL union. By 1888, there were 188 local assemblies in Iowa with about 30,000 KOL members across the state. In 1894, James Sovereign of Iowa succeeded Terence Powderly as the leader of the National Order, and Sovereign had worked and lived in Muscatine. By the 1900s, the labor assemblies of the Knights had mostly disappeared, but their ideals lived on in the collectivist aspirations of many industrial workers and organizers within and outside of the AFL. So I think you can see something like a KOL diaspora that went out across the country to work for change. Their ideals shaped the character of community and regional unionism and political activism. In many respects, the Iowa State Federation of Labor and its affiliated central labor unions simply replaced the state and local assemblies of the Knights. Arthur Holder, president of the Iowa Federation of Labor in 1902, was a former KOL member. He was instrumental in bringing hundreds of Iowa workers into AFL federal labor unions. And in 1902, the Iowa Federation of Labor led a coalition of activists to build support for a child labor bill. This included the leaders of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the Iowa Federation of Women's Clubs. Many of these women had likely also been involved in the Knights. The reason the IFL was prioritizing this was because of a rise in child labor in factories in Iowa. And the Iowa Labor Commissioner had reported in 1902, statistics of industrial accidents always show a disproportionate number of injuries to workers under 16 years of age. And this is for the very reason that the prudence and forethought by which such injuries may be largely avoided are very rare in a young child. When the Iowa General Assembly convened in 1904, the child labor bill faced opposition from button manufacturers. They feared it would, quote, ruin their industry without the employment of children between 12 and 14 years old. As Iowa's largest button manufacturer put it, "We don't want the babies. They don't watch their business, and they spoil too many buttons." As the manufacturing sector rapidly expanded across the US, the demands of mass production workers to organize on an industrial basis grew. And so Muscatine button workers organized again in 1910. They formed the Button Workers Protective Union, and this was the union that Pearl McGill was involved in. Within a few months, it was the largest local in Iowa with about 2,400 members. Manufacturers responded in Muscatine responded to the threat of a unionized workforce by shutting down most of Muscatine's button factories on February the 25th, 1911. The lockout became a strike when manufacturers reopened the factories, and much to their surprise, confronted a united front of women who refused to return to work. This precipitated a strike that quickly became known as the Labor War of Muscatine, and it lasted for 15 months. With full support of the AFL, the Women's Trade Union League sent representatives to Muscatine to help. They assisted with strike kitchens and coordinated a national fundraising effort. Button workers like Pearl McGill were on the road constantly, raising money to support the strike. Pearl worked closely with the WTUL leaders. They connected her with a network of AFL affiliates wherever she went. And in this letter, McGill is writing home on the letterhead of the WTUL from Chicago. The WTUL welcomed and mentored her. They, at their national convention in Boston in 1911, they gave her center stage. They transcribed her speech in its entirety. They nominated her to their National Executive Council. And on learning that she would turn 17 during the convention, they celebrated her birthday, toasting the girl, quote, known to fame as the youthful leader in the strike of the Muscatine button workers. They were very likely preparing McGill for a future role as an organizer in either the League or with the AFL, but that changed with the outbreak of the textile strike in Lawrence. McGill was at the League's, the WTUL headquarters in Boston when the strike of textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts erupted. She moved quickly to speak publicly in support of 23,000 striking textile workers. She brought to Lawrence a year's experience of grassroots community organizing, a network of contacts with radical labor leaders, some affiliated with the AFL, others with the industrial workers of the world. By 1912, she was an inspiring and experienced speaker, ready to provide effective assistance to the striking textile workers, many of whom were young and most of them were women. As journalists flocked to Lawrence to cover the strike, they reported on McGill in major newspapers and magazines. She was very quotable. McGill, for her part, simply adhered to the principles of industrial unionism that she learned in Muscatine, and she immediately offered her support directly to local IWW strike leaders. She never held back. At a March 4th rally, she publicly denounced the actions of the United Textile Worker president in Lawrence. She accused John Golden of undercutting the IWW, and she said, and this was of course quoted in the newspaper, "If this fight is lost, and I know it won't be, it will be because the American Federation of Labor is scabbing it." That the Boston League remained silent while the Lawrence strike was in progress is not surprising. Its allegiance to the AFL and hostility to the IWW prevented it from supporting women textile workers at the beginning of the strike. Only after the workers' victory, as historian Kathleen Banks Nutter has noted, would New York WTUL president Mary Dreyer characterize the role of the League in Lawrence as, I quote, "a general smash-up." The Lawrence strike brought to the surface deep and long-standing fissures in the American labor movement. The WTUL walked a fine line between its loyalty as a non-voting affiliate of the AFL and the demand of working women for new inclusive forms of organization. Its leaders understood the boundaries between craft and industrial unionism, sanctioned and unsanctioned strikes, internal industrial AFL unions, and rogue organizations like the IWW, and they very carefully navigated those boundaries. Building on the momentum of the Lawrence victory, McGill turned to support the textile workers on strike in nearby Lowell. She served on the strike committee of the IWW local, helped organize and lead parades, and build solidarity. Her IWW involvement effectively barred her from the AFL and the WTUL, and in 1914, she returned to Iowa and became a school teacher. Her life was tragically cut short when her estranged husband murdered her in 1924, just before her 30th birthday. The button workers lost their bid for union recognition, in part because they lacked a national union through which to fight the heavily capitalized and vehemently anti-union button manufacturers. Nonetheless, the strength of inclusive unionism enabled them to sustain a lengthy and bitterly fought battle. The central role of women, and particularly youth, together with crucial support from city centrals, state federations, and the Women's Trade Union League, provides compelling evidence of how industrial unionism flourished within and alongside the AFL's entrenched craft union ideology. By shining a light on what it meant to be a member of a federal labor union, McGill helps us understand how thousands of federal labor unions that existed between the 1890s and 1920s bridged the general unionism of the Knights and provided a precedent for the industrial unions of the 1930s. Today, young workers are leading a surge in unionization campaigns at traditionally vehemently anti-union strongholds like Amazon and Starbucks. These workers, like their predecessors over 100 years ago, represent a significant demographic of youthful labor leaders. Can the labor movement keep up with them? And what can today's labor movement learn from the youth-led organizing campaigns of over 100 years ago? What relevance do the ideals and approaches of inclusive community-based unionism, as seen in the Knights of Labor and its successors, have for today? Thank you.
Wonderful.
I'm
Thank
going
you.
to try this.
Yep.
Okay.
And let's see. Okay. So we got a couple of questions that came in while you were presenting. Tess, would you unmute your audio and ask your question, please?
Yeah, seeing the photos and as the sort of the cottage industry, as you showed, developed into this really industrialized process, was that all still being supplied by wild harvest of local bivalves?
Yes, it was. The mussel industry, actually, the fishing industry had to develop to supply the button industry because it exploded so quickly. But the mussels were very plentiful in Muscatine and all of the inland rivers. So they were able to gather them and fish them very easily at the beginning, and then they would have to travel further to harvest them. But this went on in the winter. They would dig holes in the ice and harvest mussels, but it depleted them fairly quickly. But it actually wasn't the button industry that depleted the mussel, the availability of mussels. It had more to do with the way the Army Corps of Engineers altered the flow of the river so that the natural habitat for the mussels was destroyed.
Wow. And Steve Brandt, you put a question in the chat. Would you like to unmute your audio and ask your question?
Sure. Growing up, I spent a little time in a town upriver from Muscatine, Prairie du Chien, and I know that they had a mussel harvesting industry, and the purpose there and in nearby towns, of course, was to supply the button industry. And I wondered if towns up and down the river from Muscatine also had union organizing drives to try and or were they not organized on as extensive as the industry is not organized on as extensive a scale?
I lost your audio for part of your question, but were you asking if there were other union organizing campaigns in other parts of other towns that had button factories along the river?
Correct.
Yes, there definitely were. And very early on, in 1903, there was a local in Davenport and in Dubuque. I mean, the button industry was everywhere along the river. You'll see the clamshells even today with the little discs cut out that is still there. You'll find them, you'll be able to pick them up. That shows that there was a button factory there at some point, and the workers did organize into federal labor unions in different towns. And that's why they're just very hard to see, because they're just visible as a number. In the records that I found, the only way to piece it together is by reading old newspaper articles and studying them, and then pulling a larger story together. But the chart I have of the button worker locals shows that there were many button worker locals that formed across the country, really. I think I counted at least 40 or 50.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cindy, is that you? Raised your hand? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't quite understand what a federal labor union is. And like, why would you want to be a non-voting member of like the AFL or whatever? And why couldn't they just be like federally recognized union or something? Like, I don't quite get it.
Well, they wanted to be part of the labor movement because of the credibility it would give you. I mean, Samuel Gompers was president of the AFL, and the AFL by 1910 was very much considered the respectable branch or arm of the labor movement. So that they did get some benefits by being affiliated with the AFL. When I say, so a national union like the garment workers or the steel workers would have a lot of local unions that were affiliated to that national union, and then that national union would directly be affiliated with the AFL. But for these little locals, they were directly affiliated with the AFL rather than having a national union through which they could coordinate their activities and have a greater presence and a greater voice in the policies of the national AFL.
Could they have joined like the IWW as a local?
They could have, and they did. I mean, the IWW had locals in Lawrence. They organized with the IWW as a local union, and they did that in Lowell. But the easiest way and the most probably the easiest way that they could organize in Iowa was with the AFL, because there was a precedent for doing that. And it probably also had something to do with the longtime connection to the Knights of Labor. It was a familiar sort of approach to organizing. And of course, being affiliated with the AFL, they also had support from the Iowa Federation of Labor, which is the state Federation of Labor that could also be supportive. So I think they probably felt that they had a greater support network with the AFL.
Were there employers, Janet, who were national or largely regional, that workers in different shops that were controlled by that particular employer had an interest in connecting together to make shared demands on the employer?
They didn't really get the manufacturers were very coordinated nationally, but the locals were much more isolated because, for example, there would be a manufacturer in New Jersey who also had a shop or a big factory in Muscatine, and they coordinated around the country very, very effectively. They were very heavily financed and made decisions about what was best for the industry. And but the local unions were not coordinated. They would have been more coordinated if they had had a national union, so that they could have coordinated their activities. So as it was during the strike, the manufacturers could sort of just outsource the cutting of the buttons or send it to be finished in another plant in New Jersey. So that's one of the reasons the button workers couldn't win the strike, in spite of their determination and solidarity and being supported by the AFL and the WTUL.
Thank you. Shell.
Yeah, Janet, this is, as you know, I think great stuff. But I think that your perspective on federal labor unions in terms of the larger story of trade unionism in the progressive era is really important. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the ambiguities in the relationship between these often fairly isolated federal labor unions and the AFL. And the ways in which in certain sense. I mean, it seems like the AFL used that institution as a kind of mechanism to control and contain the development of industrial unionism.
It's sort of hard. It's hard to see on the surface because it seems like a great thing that the AFL, that the federal labor unions are affiliated with the AFL, but within the AFL, they lacked a voice at AFL conventions because they didn't have a national union. If they'd had a national union, there would have been 12,000 button workers in it. That would have given them more voting rights. And so whenever they went to if they could scrape together the money to go to the convention as delegates, they didn't have the same level of voting power as a national union would, and they didn't have voice on different committees. The AFL's executive committee essentially controlled the resolutions that they would bring to conventions, and that's how the AFL was able to prevent them from forming a national union. So in a sense, it brought them in, and that was very much in the interests of the AFL because, as one person mentioned, why didn't they join the IWW? It was easier to join the AFL, but if they had joined the IWW, that would have definitely been a threat to the AFL. So bringing them into these federal labor unions easily and effectively was sort of a containment policy on the part of the AFL that was very effective.
Right.
And the way I read your piece, Janet, I thought that you were making the argument that the AFL was particularly fearful of industrial workers. And go ahead.
No, you can finish.
Well, as you know, and maybe they were doubly damned because they were not only industrial workers, but they were women, or other cases where there were industrial workers who were either African American or first generation immigrant. But the way I read your piece, it seemed as if it was the fact that they were unskilled industrial workers that was the greater source of fear for the AFL.
I think that was the greatest source of fear for the AFL. But we have to remember there was also during that period a lot of outright racism and nativism at play within society in general, and it was very much at work within the national AFL, and it varied, but it was there. Mm-hmm. And so African Americans definitely formed these federal labor unions, and it was a way of sort of appearing to be supportive, but not so much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there any examples of workers in an industry that started out with a federal labor union who were able to create a national union out of it?
That's a very good question. I would say the main successes came in the 1930s. Mm. And for example, the auto workers formed federal labor unions, and they kept forming federal labor unions. The rubber workers formed federal labor unions, but they came up against the same issue with the AFL. And in the 1930s, when workers had the right to organize, they did not allow them to form a national union. And so they split, and those national unions were formed, but with the CIO.
With this, that's helpful to think of. And yeah, great. Carol, you have a question about fashion? Because I don't know if I've ever seen a button made from a clamshell or a mussel shell. So go ahead, Carol.
I don't know if I have either, but I was wondering how the fashion industry or fashion dictates influenced the manufacturer of buttons in general, aside from
Oh,
the
it was a
union.
huge, huge influence.
Uh-huh.
The fashion industry, firstly, there was the development of ready-made clothing, and they needed cheap buttons that would adorn these very popular shirtwaist blouses, the Gibson girl blouses of the period. They had lots of tiny buttons on them. So they needed it came just at the right time to fulfill that demand. And that was a very large part of the development of the industry. The other part, pearl buttons used to be made from ocean shell, and they were made predominantly in Vienna and England, in Austria and England, and they were made from ocean shell that was imported from Australia. It would come back on ships that went out to the British Empire, to Australia. They would, the ocean shell provided ballast for the ships coming, so that the ships would go out laden with goods for the colonies, and then they would come back with ocean shell for the button industry. But the tariff changed in the US. New tariff laws were passed in the McKinley Tariff Act in 1890, I think. And that made the manufacture of pearl buttons in the United States more competitive. And it put a lot of button workers out of work overseas in Vienna and in England. And some of them came to the US as immigrants to work in the button industry here.
Wow. Other questions? Fellow worker Linda, did you have a question? See, I'll go professor and start calling on people.
Peter, I put one in the
Oh,
chat. If you don't
Will,
mind.
please,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was struck by the age that Dr. Weaver brought up, and especially in light of the New York Times recent article on child workers across the country, right? And one of my students pointed out in class this week that just firing these workers doesn't really solve problems, of course, right? That a lot of them are probably working to support their families. And my young daughter overheard your presentation, Dr. Weaver, and gasped when she heard that this leader was 17 years old, right? So just maybe you could talk a little bit more about that what we think of as 17 now wasn't what we think of as 17 back then, and in light of the New York Times report on child labor.
Right. Well, child labor, 17 was an age to be out in the world and working back then. And I was always struck by how incredibly intelligent Pearl McGill was in her writing and her voice. She really was exceptional. But I do think you grew up earlier in this time period, and children were expected to go out to work to help their families, or just to leave the house and put less stress on the home. And of course, many women wanted to go and make a living doing something other than working as a servant in domestic service. Going into the factory was more appealing in many ways. It was autonomy and earning your own money, supplementing family income, and of course, fashion. Women were very interested and connected to fashion. You've seen the pictures of the big hats that the women wore. Pearl McGill had hats like that, and there are photographs of the women from this period. They're wearing these big hats. They wanted to be part of the culture of their day, and so that's what they did.
So Yamila is with us and has raised her hand.
Sorry, no, it was a mistake.
Oh, it
I
was
don't
a
have any
mistake.
questions. Yes.
Oh, all right. So following Will's question about the age of the workers, many of us on this program tonight are in Minnesota, and we probably know more about what's going on in Ukraine than we know about what's going on in Iowa. Do you want to say a little bit, Janet, about the push to legalize child labor again in the state of Iowa?
There is a bill pending in the state legislature. That's what sort of made me go back into some of the work I'd done in my dissertation to take a look at that, this early effort to pass child labor laws. And, you know, it's hard to believe that we're going right back there when we have this evidence from over 100 years ago that young children, teenagers are not paying attention. They cannot be in these dangerous workplaces when they would be better served by being in school. I'm not sure quite where the bill is at this point, but I think they want to reduce the age to 14 to 16.
Right.
And that seems to me to be unconscionable and very unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, and including in industries that, like construction, where there's a sense of the dangerousness of the work.
Not only construction, I think also meat packing. I don't, if anybody knows more about what's going on in the Iowa legislature, please chime in here. But I think, and the other thing that's deeply concerning to me is that they are presenting this as if it's some sort of career enhancement opportunity for children. And all of these are sort of old arguments that have been voiced before, many years before. I mean, in Iowa passed a migrant child labor law in 1967 that prevented migrant children from working in agricultural with their parents. And the arguments against that was, well, what would they be doing with their time if they weren't working in the fields? It was a concern. So it does concern me that we're going back to that again, to these arguments that they just seem to resurface as a pattern through time, you know, from the very beginning when Iowa and when the first child labor law in Iowa was passed, I think in 1874, to prevent children from working in the mines. So the argument was again, well, what would they do with their time?
Yeah. Well, we like to say at the Eastside Freedom Library that we want to promote conversations between the past and the present. And listening to you, there are just so many reverberations of contemporary issues that, and you started to hint at that towards the end by talking about the Amazon workers, where there is quite a debate, I think, going on about independent organization, the Amazon Labor Union, the ALU, or, you know, other parts of the country where Amazon workers are being affiliated with, you know, various national unions. And I think there's some interest that being independent gives you more democracy and more of a voice as opposed to being saddled with a bureaucratic, unresponsive leadership. So I think this is an important part of the mix of having this conversation. And I think we're very interested at the Eastside Freedom Library in the Starbucks workers organizing, which has, you know, been very energetic here in the Twin Cities. In 2 weeks, they're going to hold a mixer at the Eastside Freedom Library, which should be pretty exciting. And it's not completely clear they are under the umbrella of SEIU. I mean, here we have a kind of mix of the existing union structures and then this quasi-autonomous project of the Starbucks Workers Union. Maybe that's a way to weave their way around the contradictions on both ends, the limitations of either less political voice, but less clout with the employers. That's very, I think, interesting stuff coming up yet that will shed light on all of this. We should get you on a speaking tour, Janet, to speak at various locals at Amazon and Starbucks. And you could still do it by Zoom. Cindy, were you going to ask a question?
Okay.
Yes.
When I was reading your piece, I thought that I read something, and I just want you to tell me if I read it right. Did the AFL offer to settle the strike in Lawrence by giving a sweetheart deal to the male workers and kind of stabbing the female workers in the back, even though they way outnumbered the male workers?
Well, it wasn't. It was the United Textile Workers, and that is a national union affiliated with the AFL, but they're in charge and they held jurisdiction over the textile workers in Lawrence. And so John Golden was the president of the United Textile Workers. And yes, you think about the textile industry in Lawrence, it employed 23,000 workers. It's hard to imagine really in one town. But at the start of the Lawrence strike, I think there were only about 250 members of the United Textile Workers because they represented the elite craft workers, the skilled textile workers whose craft was really pushed out by mass production technologies. So they're very vulnerable and fragile and small. And they didn't want the women in their union. Why? Because they would have overpowered the union. There were all these women and immigrants, and the old line textile workers wanted to maintain control of their union. So the Lawrence strike was in many ways a huge surprise that it was so successful. It was very unheard of that workers could rise up in those numbers without the support of a union and win the strike. So the UTW, led by John Golden, who worked closely with the Women's Trade Union League, did get involved in the strike, but he was only giving it lip service, not really supporting it, and definitely undercutting the women workers for sure. But the IWW would just bring them all in, industrial unionism.
Yep.
John McKenzie, you had a question. Are you there, John? Oh. Well.
I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Oh. Are you muted, John? Yeah, I see you, but I can't hear you.
Can you put the question in the chat?
Well, it's kind of a comment that is kind of long.
Now I hear you.
Can you hear me?
You're muffled.
Barely.
How about now?
I think we can make it out. Give it a try.
I just wanted to follow up to what you were saying, Peter, about who has control and whether it's better to be affiliated or not affiliated, like with the Amazon workers. It kind of reminds me of when we had our class the other night about the P9 strike workers in Austin, where the national union opposed the local. wanted to go on strike, because it's kind of a question, who knows better what the local conditions are, the people who are there, or the people at the national, and it's a control issue, I think, too. So there's a lot of issues that kind of fit into this, but it seems to me that on one hand, if it's up to the local people, they know best what's going on in their area, but they don't have the strength that comes from the national union. So it's kind of hard to know what the best way is. It's probably something you have to do on a case-by-case basis.
Well, you know, I said maybe we need a movement with multiple forms in it, multiple kinds of structures and organizations, that maybe one size fits all doesn't work. There was, during the Hormel strike, there certainly were people in local P9, particularly as they started to get out and travel around the country. I mean, it's part of what I also resonated to in Janet's presentation, that here's Pearl McGill traveling around the country soliciting funds from unions to support striking workers. It's hard to wrap my head around the logistics of that kind of travel in 1911 or 1912. But as the Hormel strikers traveled around, some of them certainly talked about, thought about, advocated for that maybe they could get out of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union and restart a packing house workers union. And of course that didn't happen. But you know, I don't think that there's one single magic form that will work. Janet, anything you want to say to that?
As far as traveling in 1911, 1912, it strikes me as surprising that people got around. They really did. They were the jet setters of their day, very much. So they were, you know, they traveled by train and they were very energetic and moved around the country amazingly. It's not just a thing that happened recently. It's sort of been going on for a while. So, and Pearl, I have to say, was not the only person out on the road. She's the one whose voice we have on the historical record, but there were many girls from Muscatine out traveling to Des Moines and other parts of the Kansas City, other parts of the country, raising money for the button workers. So they were on the road.
I want to suggest that all of you turn on your videos if you're willing. We're going to do the rest of this in gallery form, and that'll be more entertaining for other people to see your faces than black boxes. So I encourage you. Are there other questions or comments you want to make? Cindy, you're just full of questions tonight. Go ahead.
So what would happen if we went to Muscatine today? Would we see any of those buildings? And then like the industry didn't exist, and then all of a sudden it was like this pop-up industry. And then like when I think of Iowa, I just think of farmland. I can't imagine that there's like all these industrial workers and all these factories and like rallies of thousands of people. I can't imagine it. What would we see today?
Well, if you went to Muscatine today, you would see some of the old factories, the buildings, and you would even see some of the names faintly on the sides of the brick buildings. There's a Pearl Button Museum in Muscatine where you could go and you could look at the old equipment that was used to manufacture the buttons. And it's still a river town. But Iowa was actually a very industrial state. But in the early 1900s, it was the home to many factories. I'm trying to think of all the ones that existed, but meat packing industry was early in Iowa. It goes back a long way. The steel industry, there was railroad manufacturing industries, foundries, cement factories. There was a very significant industrial presence in Iowa, and really in many ways Iowa had become an industrial state in ways that people didn't think about, because they, like you, they think it's it's known for its agriculture, but there are all these agricultural related industries that started up in Iowa over 100 years ago. And so it had a significant industrial workforce, which people don't typically recognize.
Shell.
Yeah, just I wanted to mention that, in your really excellent presentation, you gave us only a brief glimpse of the labor war, as you called it, in Muscatine in 1911, 1912. I mean, a 15-month strike. And in the context of a period of mass strikes where this strike may have been small relative to some others, but a lot of the same impulses were at work there. And I wonder if you can just say a few words about the scope and the impact of that incredible strike.
It really was amazing. I kept trying to come to the end of the strike in my research, and it just kept morphing. It was complicated. It was dramatic. It was almost a page turner where I was like, well, what's going to happen next? So I didn't go into it because it's such a big story. It sort of encompassed, instead of one chapter, it ended up being 3 chapters in my dissertation. So it started as a lockout, and then it became a strike. And the manufacturers were so, they just refused to bargain with the union. They were entrenched. They would not negotiate. They would not recognize the union, and they wanted to destroy the strike. So one of the things they did at their Manufacturers Association convention in Chicago was they organized to bring thugs in to Muscatine to patrol the streets and to guard the factories. And of course, as was, it's a pattern that plays out in other parts, in much larger strikes. The thugs create trouble, and then the police come in, and then the militia is called to Muscatine, and Muscatine is put under martial law a couple of times in April 1911. And every time they think they're going to resolve the strike, the manufacturers find a reason not to. And so it just goes on endlessly. And it's incredible. There were 2,500 workers on strike in Muscatine for this period of time. And it's hard for me to imagine how these strike kitchens and money was able to sustain that many. I mean, you've got workers, but then there are their families. It's a large percentage of the population of Muscatine is actually out on strike. When you think about it, Muscatine had a population of 16,000. You've got 2,500 workers and their families needing assistance. It's really incredible that they were able to sustain the strike. And of course, the state gets involved. And so the button workers are portrayed as troublemakers and bomb throwers, and the whole thing ends up in the courts. So it's a dramatic story. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a happy ending because they lost.
Was Shelley your advisor, Dr. Weaver, in graduate school?
Yes, Shell was my advisor.
Did he push back when you said you wanted to look at Muscatine or not New York and Chicago and say, who cares about small?
I work in the Iowa Women's Archives, and when Pearl McGill's letters came to me, I immediately contacted Shell because I wanted to show him the letters because I was so amazed by them. I thought they were incredible. And I think I said, Shell, I don't know if you remember this, but I think I might have said something like, there's a dissertation in that. And you said no. You said this wouldn't be enough. But anyway, I just couldn't let it go. But I also I really couldn't understand. I felt like the letters were the tip of the iceberg. And there was this, it didn't have answers that I was looking for. Just reading the letters, it just seemed to raise questions. And really, it was great working with Shell, and he didn't push back. No, I think you were happy to be my advisor and let me do this, right?
Yes.
I was just breathless to see what you showed of the letters.
Yeah.
And I think how rare it
are.
is for a young working class woman, and for the family to have kept her letters, and it's just a treasure, and in a cigar box.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they would have survived had Pearl not been murdered. It was such a tragedy. I think they held on to that. That was their connection to her after she died. And so they were very precious. And there was also some real concern about the radical nature of the letters, especially in the 1950s. And there was concern about donating them to the archives. And Jean was very careful to wait to donate them when the time was right for the whole family. And but she was very, very certain that the letters should be preserved in the Iowa Women's Archives. She was really Pearl's first archivist. She understood her aunt and she protected those letters, and she made sure they were put somewhere where they could be used and preserved into the future. I know Shell met Jean. She was quite outspoken and quite a wonderful, wonderful woman.
Right.
Well, Shell and I went to graduate school with someone, Steve Sapolsky, who told us that in the McCarthy period, his father, who was a pharmacist, that his father dug a giant hole in their backyard and buried his personal library, for fear that McCarthy was going to come and get him.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of us are so removed from those kinds of stories that it's almost unbelievable. John Hanson, I see you nodding your head. John is the son of someone who was in the 34 Teamsters strike, and John is writing about his father. You want to say something, John?
Well, in the early 1950s, I was very young at the time, and my older sibling is 10 years older than me. And I remember the visits that came from the FBI at the time. And I wonder how much information disappeared during those days, whether people dug a hole, they burned their papers. I have this belief and verified to some extent that my dad's papers were culled out, and a lot of them disappeared at that time. And so, just having been involved in a strike on the strike committee, made my father a target of what was happening in the McCarthy area. And I remember the first time they came, I was sent outside with my siblings, and we weren't to be in there when the interview occurred. But the second time, my parents sat together on the couch, and when the FBI came, my parents said, "No, the kids are going to stay in. They're going to listen." I thought that was bold on their part.
Thank you. Linda, anything you want to say about your grandfather? You're muted. Linda, you got to unmute. There
Okay,
you go. There you
sorry.
go.
I'm the granddaughter of Vincent Raymond Dunn, who was in the 34 Teamsters strikes too. Although I like to call them truckers strikes because I get so mad at the Teamsters. But yeah, you know, I know my parents had their FBI files, and it was hard for my mother to convince my dad's family to let her marry, to get married, because she was, you know, the daughter of this infamous Bolshevik. I still belong to the IWW. I do, still active.
Great.
Anyone else? Shinoda-san, where are you?
Hi, I'm now in Boston. So today's talking is really familiar with me because Lawrence is just 30 minutes or 40 minutes to drive from Boston area. So I really appreciate your great presentation. And I was wondering if you could teach me about my question. Today's presentation, especially last part of the presentation, suggested me to think about the community-based unionism, which is better for current independent unionism, like Amazon or like Starbucks, or those unions are not yet affiliated to the industrial unions. And I'm not so familiar with the American, especially AFL-CIO organizational structure, but for instance, Massachusetts AFL-CIO has several central council, a regional council. And if kind of independent unions can affiliate to the labor central labor council, is that possible?
That's a great question. And I think we could add to the mix these worker centers that have emerged. So in the Twin Cities, there is the CETUL, predominantly, but not exclusively, Latino worker center that has close relationships with some unions, but is independent. No, Shell, you have a thought?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the impulse toward independent organization these days is very strong. And I think you're right. I mean, we have a worker center in Iowa City, in Eastern Iowa, called the Center for Worker Justice. And they've done really important work with undocumented workers, but also just workers who are outside this, you know, the realm that the organized labor movement is really trying to organize. And it gives them a powerful voice that they wouldn't otherwise have. So, yeah, I think this kind of thing is happening all around the country, and I think it's very exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is Japanese case. As you know, Japan has a country of not industrial unionism, but enterprise unionism. But 1960s, 1970s, Japanese enterprise, especially in the independent local unions affiliated to the kind of central labor council, and which was really useful for them to have a solidarity or to help each other. So and also this labor council sometimes connected with a local kind of civil rights organization. And I've been studying civil rights unionism in the United States, especially like packing house workers unions connected with African American civil rights organization or something like that. So today's presentation just inspired me to think about this kind of a coalition or making a solidarity in terms of organization or something like that. So I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
I think that kind of broad-based coalition building is really effective. And it's a pattern that, you know, you see it in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 50s, and organizations working together for collective goals. And I think that that's the approach perhaps that would best suit the climate of today, where there's so much hostility towards organized labor. And yet there are all these pockets of support that are really strong, full of activists, and these coalition, the organizations like the Center for Worker Justice, but also collaborating with the labor movement and activists and people in the, you know, professors in the College of Law to try to come to some sort of legal changes, like they made this community ID card, and that was done with the help of a law professor. And that kind of change can really be that kind of organizing can really be very, very effective. And I think that lesson comes from the Knights. This sort of broad-based cross-class community organizing is really effective. Organizing workers on a community-wide basis is powerful. Also getting people face to face to talk to each other so that they understand that they have common ground.
Great. I did my doctoral research on the Knights of Labor, so I love it that they're being invoked and positively tonight. So where, you know, they easily slid into becoming a political party in Richmond, Virginia in 1886, and won control of the city government. Which is something that no one who lives in Richmond, Virginia today even knows. You know, the pushback didn't begin with Ron DeSantis cleaning up the curriculum. Anyone else? We're almost out of time. Anyone else? Well, Janet, thank you so much for your work and sharing your time with us tonight and your knowledge, and just great.
Thank you very much for having me.
And if I haven't screwed it up, I have successfully